So I'm going to start with just a bit of a recap on where we've been in the class and what brings us up until now. So we started with a bare bones working definition of personality as being an attempt to explain relatively stable or predictable patterns of ways of thinking, feeling, and acting as it manifests within a given person over time. We're working from three different modes of investigation. We talked about empiricism, whatever it is that we can describe from the third-person extrospective frame. Now, part of the issue there with that is that many of the things that we're interested in as psychologists are not immediately accessible through that empiricist mode. So we have to arguably, so behavior is essentially what we can empirically ascertain from that third-person perspective. So we have to augment our theories with other, presuppositions or arguments to kind of fill in the ontological gaps. Like, what is a person really? How does the mind work? And so on. But if we're going to do that, then we want to make sure that we're as clear as we possibly can be on the concepts that we're using, on the various auxiliary assumptions and arguments. If an argument is kind of put forward, we want to make sure that it's a valid form of argument and as sound as we could possibly make it. So hence the conjoining of an empiricism and rationalism. So psychology, good psychology, is at least a hybrid of that, I would say. And then the third mode of investigation is phenomenology. So it takes very seriously the introspective first-person phenomena, the what it's like of experience, the structure of existence, or what it means to be a person living in the world. So those are the modes of investigation. Then, following Reichlach, we're working from an updated model of Aristotle's four causes. So material efficient cause, which kind of hang together, and formal final cause as it relates more to first-person phenomena, especially. Now, one of the papers and various theorists have made the point that psychology, the history of psychology, it seems to be in its theorizing. It seems to exalt more of a material, efficient model of causation. And not only that, if that wasn't bad enough, it's operating on an outdated version of physics, more of a Newtonian version of physics. So the argument is that if we're trying to fully account for the human being, then we have to include all those four causes. And if we're working from something less than that, we're only going to be accounting for a small little part of what it is to be a person. So the last class was our first foray into more of a theoretical discussion as it related to behaviorism. Now, behaviorism tries to turn psychology into an empirical science. So what can it describe empirically from that extrospective frame? Well, behavior, that's it. So anything other than just bare behavior, like individual motives or intentions or goals or purposes, or first-person phenomena such as qualia, the what it's like of experience, none of that matters to a behaviorist. It's unscientific as far as they're concerned. So what they're interested in is stimulus response contingencies, or as the organism responds, why it responds, why it engages in that initial behavior, whatever the behaviorist isn't really interested in, but that it changes or alters something in the environment such that a stimulus manifests in some way that has some presumably biological potency in a way that reinforces or establishes that behavior as something that is going to be highly probable over time. So there's this linkage of stimulus response contingencies as an organism unfolds ontogenetically, like through its lifespan or something like that. So personality to the behaviorist is essentially what this organism does. And it's working really just from that material efficient model of causality. So, the last class we were kind of problematizing this, will human beings human beings aren't exactly pigeons or rats, and even the behaviorist approach does a disservice even to pigeons and rats, because, you know, arguably that you can ask the question, what's it like to be a pigeon? And that's, I think, a reasonable question to ask, right? Surely there must be something in that. But, so we talked about the example from the Big Bang Theory last time, and we're wondering, okay, so Sheldon is trying to operantly condition Penny to engage in behaviors that he deems acceptable. Well, could we imagine him pushing that to the point where she's jumping out of a pool, bouncing a beach ball off her nose, or could we imagine him shaping her behavior to engage in morally dubious, you know, acts? And I think the conclusion that we came to is, well, no. You know, as long as Penny's purposes or her interpretive frame on what's happening lines up more or less what she would otherwise be happy to do, it lines up more or less with what Sheldon would like to see happen, there's not going to be too much of a problem, and maybe the stimulus would be rewarding. But once we kind of take seriously that there's an introspective account here, right? So we talked about, well, what if Penny just decides that she's going to be on a diet, right? She doesn't want to eat chocolates for a period of time. Well, what's going to happen is that stimulus is no longer going to be rewarding. And moreover, if Penny has a good idea to assume that Sheldon knows that, she might very well be offended by his offering her the chocolate, right? And then, of course, you know, once there's some enticing stimulus, let's say, to solicit, you know, a behavior, if it runs up against some kind of inner conflict or feeling or intuitive sense of what you want to be doing, in other words, there's like a dialectical process, I think, an inner conflict, we would say, that happens. Well, I maybe feel like I want to do this, but I know it's not the right thing to do, or it doesn't line up with who I take myself to be as a person. So all of that sort of thing is going to come into play, arguably, with the human being and really complicate things. So even though behaviorism has like little places where it's you know, quite appropriate and useful, we talked about the acquisition of, you know, specific phobias and how we might extinguish those phobias. Like, okay, well, that makes sense. Understanding addictions, yes. But understanding the whole person, if we're to work just from a behaviorist model, it's insufficient to our task. Does that make sense? Are we all roughly on board with that? Yeah. So, you know, the last class and the present class is going to be, you know, again, we're trying to say, okay, these mainstream-ish models, like there are places where in various contexts they make sense, but other places where not so much. So the last class and this class is, you know, a bit of a kind of critical approach to, you know, well, this class is information processing theory, and then we're going to build from there and do more of a positive kind of theory building. Okay, so information processing theory attempts to go beyond the limits of behaviorism, where the mind was treated as a black box without any speculation about what it is or how it works. So what happens inside of the organism, whether that be from an extrospective frame in terms of its mechanisms, its, you know, biological constitution, whatever, behaviorists aren't interested in that, and they're also not interested in whatever's going on at the level of, you know, introspection or perception or sensation or anything like that. They're not interested in either. So it's just stimulus response, and whatever happens within the organism from an extrospective or introspective stance, they don't care about. The information processing approach would try to go beyond that. But to do that, they would have to venture beyond what was straightforwardly, empirically obvious, that is behavior, and take a philosophical position on the nature and function of mind. So, computational information processing theorists effectively borrowed the computer metaphor from the philosophy of mind to suggest that the mind is not quite a black box, but something analogous to a computer, where different inputs or stimuli are processed according to various rules or algorithms or mechanisms to produce a given output, be it a thought or a behavior or a feeling of some sort. And this output could be kind of looped back into subsequent input in that same mechanism, or it could be that output could be the input for another mechanism to kind of follow some algorithmic mechanical process to land in another output. So when we're talking about causality, what level of causation do we seem to be operating within here? So we talk about input, there's an input, there's a processing of some sort, like an algorithmic kind of event-driven kind of unfolding over time, and it leads to an output of some sort. What does that sound like? Efficient causation. Someone said formal cause. It gets a little bit tricky. Any theorizing that we do is operating within formal cause. That's why it's so bizarre to deny it, right? But and it does get a little bit tricky with the formal cause bit, but we'll talk about that in a sec. But it's primarily operating on an efficient model of causation. So computation is often seen as a process, a series of events that transforms one representation into another through some functional algorithm of if-then relation states. So if the conditions at the beginning of that process are kind of met or link up in some way with the input, then it will guarantee a succession of events that produce a given output. So it's continuous in terms of like a temporal unfolding, and it's contiguous insofar as there are discrete entities that are being impinged upon and leading to the enactment of this cascading effect of causes in the efficient sense. Does this make sense? Yeah. Now, I have representation in scare quotes because, this is a vague, ambiguous term that seems to be used in different senses by the cognitive theorists. Representation seems to imply that there was a prior presentation, right? And so it's a representing in some way, right? Well, in what way is it representing? What was the initial presentation? Well, presumably, I guess intuitively, it's a presentation to consciousness, perhaps, that something shows up as something or other. So we want to kind of look at some of these terms as we're moving through this. But in the main, it's an efficient process, or at least causally, that's what the idea is. And cognitive psychologists try to infer the algorithms, the rules, or the heuristics with models supported by their psychological studies. They seek to discover the cognitive mechanisms that constitute the human mind. Now, when you hear the term mechanism, what model of causality should that immediately bring to mind? Material efficient causality. And so mechanism, there's a mechanistic kind of event or process or unfolding or something like that. Really, we're talking about efficient causality with presumably material cause in the background insofar as this is instantiated in some physical system, right? Now, this class is really kind of complicated. And if we can end up in sort of a nuanced understanding by the end, I will be very, very pleased. If we walk away absolutely confused, that will not be a good thing. But if we walk away like, the information processing cognitivist approach is actually not as straightforward as I thought, that would be a good outcome as well. So part of the, what you want to consider, I guess, is with the different theories, like what do these words mean? How are these words being used, right? What are the theorists trying to say, or what are they trying to do? And one of the key terms to try to wrap your head around, to see what's happening, as we try to make, the computer a metaphor to help us understand the human being, is the term information. And this isn't something that was really kind of focused on in the paper, but it is a term that comes up quite a bit within this framework. And what I would encourage you to think about and consider, and we'll just talk about here, is information as it's used in the engineering sense, as it applies to digital computers, is not at all like information in the everyday sense. And arguably the appeal of some parts of this theory, or how it might apply to places where it's not appropriate, is that it slides back and forth between these two different meanings of information. Now, if I ask you guys, to define information just in the everyday sense, like, what does it mean to be informed? What does it mean to provide information, to give information? What comes to mind? Don't think too hard about it, just, our everyday understanding of what that might involve. Yep.
So for me, information is what you use to make decisions.
So what you might use to make decisions. And how does that inform you? So it informs you in some way so that you can make a decisive act, right? In what way does it maybe inform, or what does it do? Yep.
Maybe ways like tasks and like the risks and the benefits of a decision.
Okay. So that there's an ability maybe to consider the risks and benefits as it bears on a particular course of action, right? So would we say that in some way, like information, it increases our understanding, perhaps? Would we say something like that? Yeah. What else would we say? Well, and depending on at what level we try to make sense of understanding, right? We talked or the class before, I think, about like a procedural understanding or a tacit understanding versus the more kind of logical, analytical, explicit understanding, let's say. What else would we say? Where do we tend to get our information from? In just the average everyday sense. What are some places that we could get? So we get it from other people, right? Where else could we get our information from?
Well, obviously the internet. We get a lot of stuff online.
The internet, yeah. So there's compilations. Well, it depends. I mean, it could give you information. It could misinform you, as well.
Wrong,
Yeah.
It's just like constantly bombarding you with information, right? It's hard to even get away from it.
Yeah. And would we also say that there's like maybe like factual stuff, right? Like something that we would consider to be like a fact, or like there's we're trading in concepts, perhaps, like something like that, something that bears on our interpretive frame of what is the case in the world, or as it might involve our lives and so on, right? Something like that, would we say? Now, right? I'm just going to revisit a couple things, right? And so I want to really help remind you of what's going on at this level, and then we'll show how it's not at all the same as what's going on the other side. So to be informed, to have something bear on your understanding of yourself and the world and whatever, part of that, so part of it too, what I want to say is that information in the engineering sense has nothing to do with meaning. It has nothing to do with intention either, right? So there's meaning, as we talked about in a previous lecture, in terms of use, understanding the meaning of a door by being able to open it up and walk through it. Arguably, you understand the meaning of words by using them in the appropriate context. That's a kind of understanding of the meaning of a word, even though you might not know the dictionary definition, right? Lots of people do that. I do that all the time. Like, if you're kind of forced to define something, like it's hard to do, but you use it in the appropriate context. That's a sort of understanding or way of being informed about how to comport yourself in the world. There's meaning as it involves reference. So in that, concepts refer to other concepts, or as we're putting forth something that we're claiming to be a fact, perhaps. So we might have like a signifier of some kind, and the thing that is signified, what it points toward, what it involves. Now, part of that arguably involves like a predicational process or an act, not a process in the mechanical sense, but a process in a person is doing something. So when I point to this table and I say, this is a large table, well, what am I doing? Well, in a way, what I'm doing is I'm taking the concept, the predicate largeness, and I'm extending it to include this particular entity, right? And I'm putting it together as content for you guys to look at or to consider, right? Now, if everyone looks at that and they're like, oh yeah, that is a large table, then that predicating process is solidified as a concept, and we say, well, that's a fact, right? Now, someone else might problematize that and say, oh, look, I'm a 7-foot, 400-pound Icelander, and that's a puny table. That's insufficient for anything that I'd be using it for. Or I have a family of 12 siblings, and it's just not appropriate in any way that I would use it. So it links up in some ways to our purposes or our everyday use. We'll get into some of that with the Heidegger lectures. So there's meaning as use, meaning as as it refers to things, and meaningful in terms of that which matters to you, that which bears significance on your life and your goals and pursuits, and how you choose to settle the uncertainty of the kind of being that you are, in a way. Now, part of what's going on here when we're engaging this predicational stuff is again that the human being is capable of thinking dialectically, thinking in terms of oppositions, right? Thinking in terms of so even this table here, again, what did I do? I said that it's a large table. Well, part of that implies a tacit understanding of it being the opposite of small, right? And that I'm able to kind of see that there's, I can, affirm one side of that dialectical understanding or meaning relation to put forward that act of predication. Is there anything like that going on with computers? They tend to get really kind of hung up on some of this stuff. So what do we mean when we talk about information in the computational sense? Well, information in the original engineering sense, the basic unit was and still is, the binary digit or the bit, right? Which is effectively at the level of programming ones and zeros. And arguably at the level of the hardware, as it's instantiated in something physical like a computer, we're arguably talking about the switching on of transistors, right? Which has a state of being on or off. So an information bit is essentially what it takes to select and transmit a signal from two equally probable alternatives. That's the 1 and 0, or the on or off in the transistor. And what it does is it takes all the probable pathways or possible signals in a system, and it will have them through the use of the binary digit. So essentially, if you had 4 possible signals in some communication system, it would take 1 bit to cut them in half to select the 2 that are making up that half, and it would take another bit to select from the remaining 2 possibilities. So 2 bits of information it would require to program, 1 path or 1 signal. And so what it's trying to do is it's trying to create a system that is efficient in some way or reduces redundancies and so on. Now, here's the important thing. If you're kind of fuzzy on that, that's fine. I'm kind of fuzzy on it too. But the important thing to recognize is that something in the information processing sense or in the engineering sense that bears a great deal of information content can be woefully uninformative, right? It contains no meaning in the everyday sense, right? So if you were to program a computer to randomly select a string of 8, letters in the alphabet, it would take, a reasonable amount of information in the digital sense to communicate that. Even selecting 1 letter from, 26 letters in the alphabet would take between 4 and 5 bits of information to do that. Now, Raymond Tallis points out in his book, The Explicit Animal, he uses an example to kind of demonstrate just how absurd some of this is or how it's very different from what we're doing. So he uses the example of well, how you can have something that has very little information content in the engineering sense, but it actually be quite informative. And the example that he gives is, assume you're in a relationship, and at a certain point in the relationship, you ask your partner, do you love me, right? Now we'll say there's one of two possible responses to that question. Well, yes or no, right? So in terms of the digital sense, it's only carrying one bit of information, right? But I think we would agree to anyone who's invested in the response that's actually quite informative. Like it bears a great deal of meaning or significance in terms of how we understand the relationship. Does that make sense? Are you guys roughly with me on that? Okay. So we don't want to confuse these two things. When we talk about information in the engineering sense, we're essentially talking about material efficient causality. We're talking about necessary processes and events, a kind of matching, if you will, or signalizing or transmission. We're not talking about anything that would be really relevant at the level of the human being. I guess the other thing maybe I'll draw attention to, when we talk about computers operating according to algorithmic rules, is it appropriate, do you think, to say that a computer is processing according to rules? Or in other words, like, what do we mean when we say that there's a rule, and how does that differ from like a causal law or something like that? Like when we operate, we as human beings, as we operate by rules, right? Are we able to violate those rules? Some people are nodding yes. What's that?
I think it depends.
Think-
An information processing point, I don't think so. If you're going on the yes and a no basis, 0 and 1. But
We're talking. So let's not talk about. I presume that my laptop there is not deciding and deliberately acting in a way to support my desire to teach this class unproblematically, right? But as it relates to human beings, the kinds of rules that we abide by, do we do so willingly? Do we do so voluntarily? Are we able to violate those rules if we decide to do that?
I think you could, but if there was no possibility, what's stopping you from crossing that rule?
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't think we want to deny that there's a kind of dim-witted automaticity to a great deal of human action, right? I don't think we want to deny that. People do what you're supposed to do, or you say what one says, or whatever, like within a given context. And rule following would be something like that, right? But I think what we're doing, though, is very different from what's happening within. So in other words, is the computer able to engage in any kind of process that would allow it to violate the rules or algorithms that it's programmed with? Right, yeah. No, I think that's exactly right, yeah. So I think the computer is sort of locked into, like, I'm not sure, like when we say like the algorithmic rules that it's abiding by, we're kind of speaking metaphorically, or if we want to say that there's a rule, who is operating according to the rules? Is it a who or a what, right? Because I think what we would say, or I think what I would propose is that it's the programmer actually that is operating according to, or it's imposing upon the computer in a way a set of processes, but the programmer is working within the programming language of that, of, I guess, what it is to be a programmer. Yeah.
So couldn't they be the same action just called by a different name?
It could be, but I think that would be a symptom of again, extending a metaphor, to a place where it doesn't really belong. So if the robot stalls out, is it aware that it has stalled out? Is it aware that, it has failed to, enact some protocol or reach some goal or something like that?
So if the computer gives us an error message, is that awareness? If they
for the computer?
Yeah, if they try to complete a task and they're unable to, and therefore they give the programmer, they give an output of an error message, isn't that some level of awareness?
How could it be?
In that it had to know what its intention, what its...
Well, hold on. I think you're speaking metaphorically, aren't you? Like when you say that the computer must have known.
Well, it understood its input was to get from point A to point B.
Well, again, you're saying understand.
It
You know, so
accepted
we'll just,
an input
okay.
of point A to point B.
Well, even there, you know, so when you say like understanding, I think you're kind of operating over here, and my concern is that you're kind of using some of this language that we use as human beings, and my concern is that you're imagining that a computer is perhaps doing the same thing. And what I'm suggesting is that no, at least the computers that we've been able to build at present. I mean, we can get into the whole kind of artificial intelligence stuff. Maybe next class would be a better place to do that. But do others want to weigh in on that? Like, by all means, like if you disagree with what I'm putting out there.
A computer is constrained in a different way than a human being is. So I don't really think they're comparable because a computer's constraints don't care about cultivating meaning.
Well, yeah, and I you know, is it fair to say that at the level of the human being, I mean, we're arguably to a certain degree, I mean, in many cases we're not, but we had the ability to be aware of our constraints, right? And the level of constraint, much of the time, I mean, obviously we have biological constraints, like we can't jump off a building and fly, obviously, right? But I think some of what we're talking about, they're kind of conceptual interpretive restraints, or an awareness that engaging in this course of action will lead to something that, you know, goes against my purposes, or, you know, does that make sense? Right? Some of this will become more clear in the next class, like, I guess, like trying to remind you guys of what it is to be human, and you know, what is consciousness, and what's interesting or worth noticing about that. But I would really encourage you to work from this framework here. Like when we say, okay, what's happening at the level? So go back to this issue over here. What's happening at the level of the robot? You know, well, the robot, all the robot is doing, as far as we can tell, is it's following, you know, a material efficient set of, I won't even say instructions, because the instructions are not there to inform the computer, so to speak. Like the computer at no point is able to say, well, to hell with this instruction, you know, and the computer is quite rigid. Like anyone who tries to do anything with a computer and you run up against an issue, like if you don't type in, like especially like for someone like myself, you know, who's been familiar with computers like before there was Windows, and you have like DOS programs that you're working with. If you don't type in the exact command, it's not going to work, right? And even now, like with some of the really interesting ways in which like Siri and things like that can engage with our, you know, verbal commands and respond in these, you know, awesome ways. Like it's very easy to trip up a computer, because a computer works according to like more of a demonstrative, like there's not really the ability to kind of playfully muck around with language. If you were to say, for example, you know, that movie was awfully good, right? That awfully good, right? Like, we know what that means. Like so good it's off. Like to a really high degree, it was good. But to a computer, it wouldn't be able to really kind of funnel the appropriate algorithm, or it would be very difficult to respond to something like that. And in truth, the computer is not really responding. It's the programmer who is anticipating what the user is looking to do, and then sets the instructions such that with the appropriate input, it, you know, follows a cascade of law-like events that produces, you know, an output, and we recognize it as such, as an output. Are you guys with me on this? This is like really hard stuff to try to talk about, but okay. So mainstream cognitive psychology tends to be functionalistic, as opposed to a more realistic description of underlying parts. So mainstream information processing theory, it's not really concerned so much with how does this become instantiated within a nervous system or a computer or whatever? Like, it just assumes that with the right functional relations, with the right symbolic manipulations, you can kind of bring about something like a human being, or you're able to make sense of the relation between input and output. So at one level, we have a computational level. Why do things work the way they do? What is the goal of this computation, and what are the unifying principles? So when we say, what is the goal of the computation? It's not what is the goal of this individual person in this particular context as it relates to, their aims or goals or anything like that. It's more like, how do we explain from an extrospective mode of theorizing the relationship between input and output? That's what it's doing. There's the algorithmic level. What representations can implement such computations? How does the choice of representations determine the algorithm? And then the implementational level, how can such systems be built into the hardware, be it computer hardware or in our neurobiology? So cognitive neuroscience, this is what it tries to do, is it tries to figure out how these algorithms could be imposed upon, the real workings of the nervous system, this kind of thing. So again, we don't want to, the information processing approach, or this computational kind of algorithmic, if-then kind of material efficient causal unfolding of events with the appropriate stimulus, we want to acknowledge that, okay, there's a way in which that mode of theorizing is quite enlightening and helpful and appropriate, perhaps. But what we're suggesting is that there's another level in which it's going to be inadequate, mainly because people are not computers. Computers are not doing anything like what people do. So there are some parts of the nervous system that are roughly computational, if we carry that metaphor over, involving domain-specific, so working within a particular domain of inputs and relevant outputs. They're automatic. There's a mandatory operation. They'll operate whether you intend them to or not. There's a neurolocalizability. Anyone who's taken an intro neuroscience course knows that the nervous system is organized into particular functions that are spatially located. There's central inaccessibility. So regardless of, again, what you want to perceive or how you want something to be perceived, like your nervous system is going to run of its own accord and it's going to do its thing. So just the example, the Mueller-Lyer illusion that you guys are familiar with, even though we know that these two lines are the same, for whatever reason, our perceptual apparatus kind of works in a way that we tend to perceive that bottom line as being shorter than the top. Of course, there's brain lesions and predictable functional deficits, functionally specified neurobiological systems, including visual recognition of faces, emotional expression, language. So again, Wernicke's area is involved in phonological processing. Broca's area is involved in being able to speak. And most of the evidence, the clearest kind of evidence of this kind of modular, kind of mechanistic, algorithmic type processing is within the lower nervous system in the primary cortex. Yet we also want to recognize that the brain is highly plastic, involving neural growth, pruning, differentiation of networks, that arguably involves environmental experience and use, especially as it relates to secondary, tertiary, and associational areas that are involved in the majority of the neocortex and higher order psychological processes, the all kinds of stuff that we're talking about up here. Consciousness and self-aware consciousness. So these areas lack characteristics indicative of a pre-specified modularity, though with experience and use they often build on functional complexity of adjacent areas. So again, I want to emphasize that this model or this mode of theorizing And I'm describing something that, like, there's all kinds of different information processing theories and different ways to do, like, a cognitivist approach. And, you know, I'm just giving broad strokes here. But it tends to be emphasizing more of an efficient cause process. How do you do, like, a better cognitive science that takes seriously introspection and the kinds of things that we're talking about over here? Well, we're going to get to that when we get into the Heideggerian stuff. There's a radically situated, embodied cognitive science that I think is right on board with kind of capturing the kind of phenomena that we would be interested in capturing, right? But the mainstream kind of approach that you know, you guys might have been exposed to, or at least historically, it's taken up a lot of attention and time. This is what it looks like. Now, this is sort of this weird bit. The idea, this is something that's carried over into some of the clinical work, but the idea is that changes in cognition interpreted as, you know, computational algorithms will produce a change in output. Now, again, like when we're talking about representations, it's almost like the representations are kind of viewed from an extrospective mode of theorizing, and the idea is like, well, how does this representation get associated with another representation, and how those representations get funneled into some algorithmic process that can guarantee some output or something like that. That's sort of how they're working at the level of representation. Information processing theorists tend to avoid claims about how these purported information processing mechanisms came to be. So they're not really interested in, you know, the whatever kind of phylogenetic interpretation or evolutionary kind of story about how whatever mechanisms are there, like what they're about, whether they're, you know, derived socially or just through being or existing in the world, or, you know, evolution. But the mainstream evolutionary psychologists carry all of these same assumptions and take it one step further. So in other words, all the problems that are going to be there for the information processing, computational modeling, all those problems are going to exist when you go carry that over into the mainstream evolutionary psychology program. So evolutionary psychologists suggest that the human mind is a complex, integrated assembly of many functionally specified psychological adaptations, which are information processing circuits that take in delimited units of information and transform them into functional output designed to solve a particular adaptive problem, right? So the idea is something like, I don't know, like presumably like electromagnetic wavelengths, you know, light energy comes in through the retina, it sort of, you know, activates, you know, because of visual line orientations or the shape of some object, it activates some neural structure that is able to identify some entity in the world as a snake, and that sort of activates, you know, some additional part of that module that creates a fear response and the subsequent behavior of jumping away from this thing that is a snake, which had the adaptive purpose of preventing us from being bitten by entities that are venomous, which would cause us to die, right? Something like that. That would be sort of the story of how something like that works. So the form of the mechanism, again, when you hear mechanism, immediately you should link that up with efficient causality. The form of the mechanism, its set of design features, is like a key made to fit a particular lock. So with the right input, it kind of works with that mechanism to guarantee a given output of some sort. That's how this sort of works. Now, I want to maybe kind of say a few things first. Like, so the paper that I have you guys like kind of set to read, and I'm thinking like I'm just going to gloss over some of this. You don't have to read it, but I think it would help maybe contextualize some things. If there's a question on the test, like maybe like, well, what would be a criticism of a paradigm like evolutionary psychology? Like, what would be one angle or one criticism of that approach? That's how you might prepare for the test. But so when I wrote this original kind of target paper, it was 2011. I'd shortly gotten out of graduate school. And basically the argument that I was putting forward in that paper, I was I was still working from, I would say, more of a neurobiological kind of framework, and the argument that I was putting forward in that original paper was that the evolutionary psychologists were making these, kind of hypotheses and, interpreting the data in a way that didn't really seem to link up very well with our understanding of how the nervous system actually works. So, and this is a criticism that Jacques Panksepp, if anyone's familiar with him, he literally wrote the book on affective neuroscience, and he had studied concretely physical systems as it related to, small mammals, and, he was trying to understand how some of this links up with, human affect programs and so on. And Panksepp is a brilliant guy, made all kinds of really important contributions. He's now since passed, but he was very critical of evolutionary psychology. So when I say that I'm opposed to evolutionary psychology, I want to make very clear, I'm not opposed to our evolutionary theorizing as it relates to the human being. I'm not opposed to anything like that. I'm opposed to a specific way of doing it. And that specific way of doing it is the cognitivist information processing thing. So when I made that initial argument, it was an okay paper, but I look back at it and a few parts of it toward the end, like I could tell that it was there was a sort of angsty kind of trying to kind of be witty and kind of get a little dig and stuff like that. And I think part of it was the arguments between the evolutionary psychologists and the people that are opposing this, they were getting quite vicious, so I think some of that was kind of coming into that. I think part of it too is that I was kind of getting the same thing that we talked about in the first parts of the course. I think I was getting caught up in this little conceptual community, and it was, again, it kind of tends toward that dogmatic kind of a team kind of tribal type thing. I think there was some of that was playing out. So I'm humble enough to acknowledge that I think I got caught up in a bit of that. But the subsequent exchange, which actually, so there's 2 years in between that paper and the paper that was responding to a criticism of my paper, I'm actually very happy with how that turned out, and I think it actually drew attention to, or was able to draw attention to, or I was able to be aware of what some of the issues were. But it was only years after that I was able to kind of read Raymond Tallis and Joseph Reichlach and understand that no, the issue is not just evolutionary psychology. The issue is how we as psychologists make sense of causation. That's what the issue is, as far as I can tell. So we want to look at how does the evolutionary psychologist make sense of a causal explanation. So they would adopt, from evolutionary biology and ethology, a model of causation that you learn about in your textbooks involving Tinbergen's 4 questions and Mayer's proximate ultimate distinctions. So what is that? Well, Tinbergen's 4 why questions involve the immediate influences on behavior, the physical events that are unfolding in the present, presumably, the developmental influences on the behavior, so in terms of the organism's ontogeny, the life events, the function of the behavior, its adaptive purpose, from, again, a gene's eye view, and evolutionary or phylogenetic origins of behavior. In other words, the evolutionary events which led to the origin of a given mechanism. So Mayer's ultimate proximate causes involve proximate questions, explanations that have to do with the putative mechanisms, the how questions of how these mechanistic processes are unfolding. And then the ultimate questions concern the evolution of the trait, which is, why does this trait exist? What is its adaptive function in an evolutionary sense? So just to draw attention to this, we're talking about impersonal, event-driven change versus agent-driven action. We're talking about the function or purposes from a gene's eye view, an extrospective gene's eye view. Again, it's a personless view. We're talking about event-driven mechanisms. Again, we're working within an efficient model of causality. And again, an explanation again from a personless viewpoint. Now, so my argument would be, look, this is a theory that claims that it's going to be an umbrella approach, a grand model that is able to account for, the whole human being. This is what it tries to. This is what it claims. I can give you all kinds of quotes that suggest that people are wanting to do this. Now, what is the problem? You know, like if someone was to say, look, you know, of course we're interested in mechanisms and biology, and that's what evolutionary psychology is. So who cares if this is a restricted kind of sense of causation that we're working within, right? Now, if someone was to make that claim, what would be the counterclaim? Like, how would we, like, would we just accept that, I guess? Or what are the problems with just, like, claiming that you're working within that model, I guess, and you know, whatever else, they're not interested in that stuff anyway. They're just interested in the mechanisms. We're talking about the interpretation, I guess, of various psychological phenomena. Like if you are working from this model, what are going to be some of the issues, I guess, if you're not, I mean, if you're not even aware that there's another model, right?
Well, I guess back to that, I'll see all this and then it's like, okay, well, I'm still cultivating meaning. It's like this whole part of myself is not being addressed by any of this. And that's my experience, and that's never going to change unless they somehow mind control me.
Well, how do you know that you're cultivating meaning, though? Like maybe that's actually just the product of an evolved mechanism that...
Because I'll never live outside that. It's like that will always be my perspective.
Right.
So that to me is an important thing that needs to be addressed.
I think the problem is that if you're not able to account for this phenomena over here, you don't have you're not even dimly aware of a theory that could, right? What's going to happen is that this kind of phenomena, you're probably going to be at risk of misinterpreting through this lens over here. In other words, like even if you want to say, look, all we're interested in is studying evolved mechanisms from a biological frame. That's fine. We just want to work over in this area here. But you have to be aware of the boundary conditions where your theory ends and another theory begins, right? Otherwise, again, from as far as I can tell, you're at risk of misinterpreting a number of things or not being able to explain things at all. So I just want to read a couple quotes here. This is from Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. And so there's, part of it is like, if you want to say that there's such a thing as free will, right? That people do make choices, that they're responsible for their actions, right? It's not just a product of prior experience and genetic inheritance or something like that. You should have some way of explaining it. Now, the evolutionary psychologists they're not necessarily determinists, right? They could believe in free will. There's this curious passage here by Steven Pinker. So again, he says that the mind is like a computational system instantiated in biology and so on. But he says, nature does not dictate what we should accept or how we should live our lives. And then he says later on, I'm happy to be the way that I am, and if my genes don't like it, they can go jump in the lake. Now that's the right thing to say, right? But the problem is, does your theory allow you to say it? That's the issue, right? But he doesn't seem to appreciate that there's something maybe important to account for here. He says, how can a book, he seems to acknowledge this, how can a book called How the Mind Works evade the responsibility of explaining where sentience comes from? And he says later on, at least for now we have no scientific purchase on a special ingredient that gives rise to sentience. So presumably he's looking for a special ingredient over here in the material efficient causal stuff. It's not just that claims about sentience are perversely untestable, presumably in the empirical sense. It's that testing them would make no difference to anything anyway. Our incomprehension of sentience does not impede our understanding of how the mind works in the least. I think I would disagree with that. I think sentience is actually quite important. It's an important part of. But what's really interesting is, and this is my concern or my worry, is that he tries to describe. He talks about art, humor, religion, things like that I think would be part of more of our formal, final, causal kind of living, existing within a community of other human beings, and having existential dilemmas and trying to draw attention to various lived truths and so on. How can we make sense of this if the mind is a naturally selected neural computer? And then he talks about art. The arts engage not only the psychology of aesthetics, but the psychology of status. The very uselessness of art that makes it so incomprehensible to evolutionary biology, makes it all too comprehensible to economics and social psychology. What better proof that you have money to spare than you're being able to spend it on doodads and stunts that don't fill the belly or keep the rain out, but that require precious materials, years of practice, a command of obscure texts, or intimacy with the elite. I don't know if that strikes anyone as odd, but I mean, essentially saying that you know, the creation of art must have served some biological kind of evolved purpose in that you're demonstrating your status by producing it or something like that. Does anyone else have like a kind of reaction to that? Yeah? I think for art, for most people, it's like, no, it's part of like, it speaks to your lived experience. It's an attempt to kind of express some lived truth in some way that resonates with another person. It has this profound impact, right? That's what art is. That's happening over here at this level. It's not happening at that level, right? Or if you want to say that there's a part that's operating on that level, well, you have to be able to work within both models so you can try to say what's what and try to tease that apart. One way to try to make sense of a thinker is to try to, you know, do a little bit of psychology. What is this person all about? What are they concerned about? What are the issues, or how do they seem to see the world? And I'm going to share with you, like, you'll understand a little bit of what I'm trying to do in the course. Like, for me, psychology has either kind of lost its way or it has never found it, and we need to kind of reform it in some way. Well, what is psychology? What is personality? It's the study of the person. Who is the individual, right? How do we account for that person? That's what it's about. And in my mind, you know, what happens is that psychology is at risk of falling into forms of reductionism. On the one side, there's the risk of falling into a biological reductionism, where people are reduced to, you know, impersonal mechanisms or biological events, right? And it's a dehumanizing of what it is to be a person, because a person is much more than that. Now, I had been kind of somewhat blind to another form of reductionism that I see far too much of nowadays, and that's a reductionism into the social. That people are nothing more than some social, members of a social category. That the most important thing that I could possibly know about you is your race or your gender, perhaps your sexual orientation. And to me, that's another kind of reductionism that is very, very worrisome to me, because the individual is absorbed into a collective, and we lose sight of that person. I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to do the reflection papers, and